maybe just in your mind, just think about the top 2 crises in the country at the moment. Is my presentation been loaded? Thank you. And if theft and vandalism is not in your top 2, then you need to catch a cat, wake up. Because where we work, this is what we see. Whatever resilience we put in place, whatever infrastructure, that is becoming a serious crisis. So I'm going to talk about some of the international experiences. My storyline is around, I'll set the scene locally. How do we need to shift that paradigm? And I'm going to use the framing lens. We've heard about risk. We're going to look at some of the community responses and some of the solutions. And something, you'll notice something very quickly. Okay? So disasters and climate change and sustainable development are linked. One issue that cuts across all 3 is extreme events. So if you put on your TV on the news in the last 2 weeks, and when they had the weather component on it, it's always a typhoon, a hurricane, a storm surge, a wildfire, etc. And societies are not well adapted to extreme weather that we're experiencing today, because when they say these things, they say it's the biggest in 100 years. We are currently experiencing the warmest summer on record. So heat is a problem, because heat is energy, and that energy drives the global system. And these are some of the issues, and these are the results that we commonly see and often experience as well. But again, if you just look at the graph, and this is some of the work that we've been doing at the Water Research Commission for some time. If you look at the top cartoon, you'll see blue going into brown. So blue means it was a wetter period going into a drier period. And if you go from the top to the bottom, you go from summer to spring with autumn and winter in the middle. And you can see somewhere in the 70s, we've moved out of a wet period into a very drier period. So we've been in climate change for 50 years. It's not something that's going to happen. I often hear that climate change is going to do that. We've been experiencing, but what's happening at the moment is that we see that it almost had that predictability. So it had, usually when we were at school, we were taught about return periods. But now that return period has kind of been wiped off, and what you often now hear is that the whole season's rainfall arrived in 1 day or 2 days. This is the Etiquette story. And what's the result of that? The result of that is our infrastructure was never designed for all that water to, so it's usually sized over a season for 3 months. So say, for example, my rainfall is 500 millimeters, so it splits, and when we design our infrastructure, it's over 3 months, the season. But it was never designed for it to arrive in 24 or 48 hours. And at the bottom is the one that should worry you, and it should be, if you're a decision maker, it should be imprinted in your mind. So as we march towards the end of the century, 2100, what we see that Southern Africa is becoming more and more drier, and all those colors are different models. And these models kind of agree that we're marching towards dryness. Okay, and this is on average, of course. But you'll also see there's a lot of noise in the graphs, and these are the extreme events where we swing from high intense precipitations to very dry seasons, and we go up and down like this. And of course, we've experienced this already. The other problem in terms of a localized context is that the climate literacy, and so on the map, you want dark green. So if the green is too light to you, it means that the climate literacy, and this was from an Afrobarometer survey, it means that the climate literacy is fairly low. So it's from 1 to 20, etc. So even if there's an error of 20 or 30%, it brings you to 50%. But for an area that's going to experience some of these issues, it is a big problem. And then, of course, we want to shift this paradigm. So, again, in the international context, I watch a lot of TV, I read a lot of things. The one that's dominant is a top-down kind of interaction. Government to society is then treated as an interested and affected party. But what we want to shift towards or create that balance is where community, and so when we start talking about social compacting, how do we use communities that has that local expertise, that has that local interest, and bring that in that social learning? How do they experience a drought? How do they manage through that drought? How do they improve their thing? And I'll show some examples of that. Okay, so you want to go from a responsive to a reactive and proactive thing. This thing is not moving. Okay, and again, the lens that we want to use is to use this risk equals hazard times vulnerability divided by resilience. Okay, so and if you look at the world map, the stuff or the points that's in red. So this methodology takes all events, runs it through a methodology, and then says these are categorized as natural and these are man-made. And again, you can see for a decade or so, it is just red in terms of some of these events. And of course, we've heard about polycrisis, but we also have multi-hazards that kind of fluctuate between drought, storms, floods, fires, etc. And these have all been in the news in the last week, etc. And so the hazard is there, we know it's coming and we're experiencing. Vulnerability is how do we plan and how vulnerable things is, because you can have the hazard, but if there's no vulnerability, it is just a storm somewhere, and that's why we don't hear of it. But if you have destruction of infrastructure, lives, etc., it means they were vulnerable to the hazard, and again, the resilience. And what we want to do is we want to reduce the vulnerability and up the resilience. It's moving. Okay, so and that's just what I said. So as I said, if the hazard is realized, you have high vulnerability, you have a disaster. Okay, but what we know is that in a crisis, neighborhoods are almost always the first responders. But when you watch your TV on all these international events, you have the chief or whoever or the mayor, and he's surrounded with people with all these badges. But what you do not see in these interactions is the community members. They are always treated as that interested and affected party or that victim. And I think that part of the lesson is how do we change that. Okay? So internationally also there are kind of two schools. You have community responses that's supported by government. And then you also have community-led responses. So communities take the charge, government supports. And I think you probably need a hybrid based on the context at any particular period. Yeah, that minute is, okay. And again, so what we want to do, and again, you can just read, for example, how do we improve adaptation, co-designing with engineers. So you use communities to co-design climate-smart infrastructure. So you build back smarter using local knowledge. You don't do like a certain metro that had a huge flood, go and replace as if the same event is not going to happen. We know it's going to come again. And the silliness of that just boggles the mind. And then how do we increase resilience to absorb some of these things? And this is just some of these things. And of course, Dr. Suleiman will expand on some of these. And here's just a very good example. So when people say there's no social compact, etc., here's an example. Social compact is not a thing, it's not a goal, it is the process. It changes always within context, scale, etc. So here's a project that we did at the Water Research Commission where we took local knowledge, we optimized that indigenous or local knowledge with scientists and engineers, and we've increased resilience, world-beating. And again, I'm circling back that we don't need international best practice. We are doing it world, and we're winning things. Citizen science is another very good example where we use citizens to build that learning, to build that understanding, to also to complement our monitoring, because one thing that we've done in the world, and in South Africa in particular, is that we've now covered the fuel gauge in our car by underfunding and cutting budgets in our data and monitoring. We are not interested how full the tank is. But because we have these crises, we need to we have more data stations, etc. And again, citizen science is the way to go. So you build capacity, you bring in people, etc. And again, South Africa is a world beater in this domain. But again, it's about scaling and integration. This is our problem. We do not integrate enough. And again, how do you use the scientific community, government communities? And we have some good examples, but we need to get this better rather than it's just government or it's just communities or it's just the science. It's how do we create that mechanism that we are doing. So it requires a systems approach for a complex system issue. And again, how do we do that? The business as usual at the moment, very uncoordinated. Impact but we want to get to that transformational space where we connect and coordinate, and that is my story for today.